A University of Melbourne study has found misogyny is the clearest warning sign of violent extremism, more so than someone's political or religious beliefs or how much time they spend online. Report author Sara Meger is from the University of Melbourne and joins me now for more on this. Sara, thank you so much for your time today. Look, reading through the reporting around this, you found that the number one thing predicting whether or not someone is going to hold extremist attitudes is whether they think violence against women is acceptable. Did that surprise you?
I suppose it didn't really surprise me because this was the core question guiding the research. And that's based on, years of qualitative research that has been done showing this history of domestic violence perpetration or misogynistic attitudes in the manifestos of extremist groups or mass violence perpetrators. But I think what did surprise me was the strength of the relationship and also the frequencies of these attitudes being expressed in Australia.
So what can you tell me about who it was that was surveyed and the sorts of questions that they were asked?
We sought to survey, we did two samples essentially. So we wanted to get an idea of the attitudes, political attitudes, gender attitudes, online behaviors of a youth sample, age 13 to 17, and an adult sample so that we could answer the question called to us by government, I suppose, of how do we account for rising rates of extremism in young people in Australia. So we asked 1,100 teenagers and 2,300 adults the same sets of questions about their attitudes towards women, violence against women, their political leanings, and then questions about extremism and the online behaviors that they engage with. And we're able to draw these sort of cross-cohort comparisons.
Yeah, we've got some of that data that I want to bring up for our audiences here, because some of these numbers really surprised me, and I think a lot of people reading this story today. For example, 16% of Gen Z boys agreed that it was okay to pressure girls into sex, compared to 2% of boomer men. But also 9% of girls thinking it's okay, compared to 0% of boomer women. Does this data show that we're going backwards when it comes to attitudes towards equality, do you think?
I think it's showing us that there is some sort of social or political influence affecting younger generations that is undoing the decades of consent education that we've now had in Australia. And I don't know, the data can't tell us whether these attitudes will persist, whether it's just something about being young today, but it certainly is suggesting that we have greater intervention needs within this cohort right now.
Yeah, some of the other questions, particularly related to feminism, also showed some really negative views. What do you think is behind this?
There's been so much rhetoric, especially online, in about the last 10 to 15 years about feminism being damaging to society, about being a cancer, being itself a hate movement, that has become really socially popular, I think, and amplified enormously by what's called the manosphere. Now, other studies have already shown the prevalence of these ideologies that originate in the manosphere but become, just obvious or kind of pushed through algorithmic recommendation systems to general audiences, such that upwards of 30% of YouTube Shorts content is explicitly misogynistic or championing this idea that feminism is a hate movement.
And so I guess that sort of goes into my next question, which is how do these views then sort of develop into extremism?
So given that so many of these extremist groups from these qualitative studies that I mentioned earlier noted the centrality of opposition to feminism or hostility to women in the political agenda, I think what happens is that there's this sense of sort of growing grievance, or this sense that men and boys are under threat, that is being amplified online. And then this different political groups are able to leverage that to say, well, we've got the political solution. Our agenda, our political agenda, is going to reconstitute an appropriate gender order, based on traditional gender roles where women are women and men are men. And this translates then into the use or the legitimacy of violence to institute that political agenda. And especially if you can make those opposed to your political agenda part of the understanding of the corrupt gender order, because they aren't fulfilling the right roles of men and women. They are somehow defying the natural gender order, and this is what requires force to rectify.
Sara, your report also has a series of recommendations around how to sort of combat this extremism. Can you talk me through some of those?
Because our findings showed that the attitudes were showing up younger than perhaps we expected, they were concentrated in youth, and it was also supplemented with further survey research with Australian teachers. There's a few key recommendations that I make. Firstly, we need to be investing in more primary prevention. Australia has one of the world's, most advanced primary prevention programs for addressing hostile gender attitudes and gender inequality. And unfortunately, it's not really evenly applied throughout jurisdictions in Australia. So if we were to mandate early intervention in schools to help reduce these attitudes. But the other thing that the study shows is the influence of these online spaces and rhetorics is amplifying rates of misogynistic attitudes and attitudes permissive of violence against women. So the other key recommendation I make is that the government ought to be doing more to regulate what we see online, what's considered acceptable content for even adults to be exposed to online.